When I saw him standing in the hallway, holding my coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle and lipstick stain I never washed off, my chest tightened. But it wasn't fear. Not at first. It was the recognition of something that had been building for weeks, something I had refused to name. His eyes met mine, and in that split second, I knew he was going to say something I wouldn't be able to forget. He had that look, the one people get when they decide to cross a line they can't uncross. I told myself to stay calm, to respond like I always did, polite, distant, safe. But my heart was already racing, because 3 months ago I did something I never thought I would. I crossed my own line. And now he stood there, not my husband, but his friend, the man who had been living under our roof, with a question in his throat that would shatter everything if spoken aloud. My fingers gripped the kitchen counter behind me, steadying a body that no longer felt like mine. And when he opened his mouth, I wanted to stop him, but I didn't. Because some truths don't need permission to surface. Some secrets claw their way into daylight whether you're ready or not. Before I take you through the chain of events that led to that moment, tell me, have you ever let something grow in silence, knowing it would destroy everything if spoken out loud? Share in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had a secret that nearly swallowed you whole. Because what happened to me wasn't an accident. It was a slow, quiet unraveling. And it started here. I never wanted anyone else in our house. When my husband first mentioned that his old friend needed a place to stay, just for a while, maybe a month or two, I didn't argue. That was the first betrayal. Not of him, but of myself. Because deep down, something resisted the idea. Not because I distrusted his friend, but because I distrusted the stillness of our home. I had spent years keeping things in balance. The routine. The gentle distance. The little silences that passed for peace. And now someone else was going to live inside that? He arrived 2 days later. A single duffel bag, a tired smile, and eyes that scanned the house like he was remembering it from another life. I met him at the door, half smiling, already in hostess mode. "Make yourself comfortable," I said. He did, but not in the way I expected. From the beginning, he noticed things my husband hadn't in years. A light bulb flickering in the hallway. The way I flinched slightly when someone called my name too loudly. The stack of psychology books I kept meaning to give away but couldn't. He asked about them. He asked about me. It was subtle at first, casual questions over tea, small jokes passed across the dinner table. But even those small attentions felt like someone pulling loose a thread I had wrapped tightly around myself. My husband was, as always, immersed in his work. He never suspected anything because, in his mind, nothing could be wrong. We had no fights. No drama. That was the problem. Our lives had become efficient, synchronized like a machine, but utterly bloodless. I could go days without being touched. And then one evening, maybe a week after the friend moved in, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I didn't recognize myself. I was wearing one of my older blouses, hair pinned loosely, lips bare. There was no softness left in my eyes, no trace of the woman I used to be, the one who once danced barefoot in the kitchen just because she liked the song. I stood there staring at myself, feeling like a guest in my own life. And when he walked past me that night, the friend, he paused. Just for a moment. "You look tired," he said. Not unkindly. Not flirtatiously. Just observantly. But it was the first time in months someone had looked at me, not through me. The next morning, I noticed my coffee mug was already filled. The chipped one. The one I always chose. "Figured you'd want it," he said, not looking up. He handed it to me like it was nothing. Like it was everything. I told myself I was imagining things. That kindness wasn't intimacy. That noticing wasn't seduction. But I knew, even then, that something was waking inside me, a kind of hunger I had taught myself to ignore. By the second week, I found myself dressing with more care. Not for him. That's what I told myself. For me. To feel visible again. To remember what it meant to take up space not just as a mind, but as a body. We crossed paths constantly. In the kitchen, in the hall, once even at night when I came down for water and found him reading in the living room, barefoot, legs tucked under him like he belonged there. He looked up and smiled. I smiled back. And then I turned and walked away, my throat tight with a tension I refused to name. At work, I began to falter. Nothing dramatic. Just small slips. Forgetting to return a call. Losing track of time during sessions. My students noticed before I did. One of them lingered after class. "You seem distracted lately," she said. I smiled too quickly. Just a busy month. But inside, the distraction had become a current, something pulling me away from the shore I'd built my life on. My husband remained oblivious. Or perhaps just uninterested. He would ask how my day was, then check his email as I answered. At night, he'd fall asleep before I finished brushing my teeth. I told myself it wasn't his fault. That no one is obligated to remain fascinated by the same person for decades. But God, how I ached for him to even glance up. Then one afternoon, as I stood by the window watching the trees bend in the wind, the friend walked into the room and stood beside me. We didn't speak. Not at first. The silence between us had grown heavier. He didn't try to touch me. He didn't even look at me. He just said, "This house feels different than I remember." "So do I replied, before I could stop myself. He turned to me then. Slowly. Not with surprise. With understanding. Like he had known that truth was waiting there, just beneath my skin. I left the room. I had to. My hands were shaking. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed I shared with my husband and tried to remember the last time it had felt like ours. I couldn't. That night, I lay awake for hours. I listened to the house breathe, the creaks, the sighs, the low hum of pipes behind the walls. I thought about what it meant to be faithful, not just to a person, but to a version of yourself that no longer exists. And in that darkness, I made a quiet promise to myself, no more pretending. But I didn't know then that pretending was already behind me. That the unraveling had already begun. It didn't take long for the air between us to change. There were no confessions, no dramatic shifts, no open acknowledgement of what we both felt. But everything, every glance, every silence, started carrying weight. Invisible, yet undeniable. And perhaps that was what made it harder. When something isn't spoken, it has room to grow, quietly and without boundaries. It sneaks into moments, distorts the ordinary. That morning, I found myself lingering in the kitchen long after I had poured my coffee. He was already there, reading something on his phone, his hair still wet from a shower. The sleeves of his shirt were pushed up, revealing forearms I had no business noticing. But I did. And that alone made the kitchen feel too small. He looked up and gave a soft nod, as if greeting was optional now, not necessary. I responded with a nod of my own. We existed like two people stuck in a moment that hadn't happened yet. My husband had left early, a work obligation that required his attention across town. He had kissed me lightly on the temple before he left. I had barely registered it. After breakfast, I went into my office. I had a session scheduled with a longtime client, a woman going through a difficult separation. Listening to her speak, I found myself thinking not of her words, but of the ache in my chest that had grown heavier these past few days. I kept nodding, offering guidance, but I wasn't fully present. I was picturing that pause in the hallway yesterday, the way he had looked at me not with desire but with understanding. That, somehow, was more dangerous. I wrapped up the session and closed my laptop, staring at the blank screen for a long time. Then I stood up and moved toward the bedroom mirror. I tilted my head slightly, studying my face. I didn't look different. But I felt like someone I didn't know. Later that afternoon, I found him outside, trimming one of the overgrown hedges near the porch. He had asked about helping around the house when he first arrived, and now he did these little tasks without prompting. I stood in the doorway for a moment, arms crossed, watching the rhythm of his movement. He didn't see me at first. But eventually, he looked up, and we locked eyes. I didn't smile. Neither did he. Instead, I stepped outside. The sun was warm, but a breeze cut through it, teasing the edge of my blouse. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself. He leaned on the garden tool and said, "You okay?" I nodded. Just needed air. There was a pause. You ever feel like something's coming, but you don't know what? I don't know why he asked that. Maybe he wasn't asking me at all. Maybe it was just a thought spoken aloud. But I answered anyway. Every day lately. He held my gaze for a moment too long. Then he went back to work, and I turned around and went back inside. But something had shifted in me. Again. That evening, my husband called to say he'd be home late. I was sitting in the living room, the windows open, letting in the early scent of autumn. I turned on some quiet music, the kind I used to listen to when I wrote research papers in grad school, wordless, atmospheric, just enough to keep the silence from becoming too loud. He came into the room and sat on the opposite end of the couch, a book in hand. We didn't speak for a while. Just the turning of pages, the occasional rustle as I adjusted the cushion beneath me. But the space between us felt different. Like it was no longer safe. Eventually, I got up to make tea. In the kitchen, as I waited for the water to boil, I leaned on the counter, palms flat. I closed my eyes. My heart was moving faster than it should. I tried to ground myself, naming things I could hear, feel, smell, a technique I had taught clients 100 times. But it didn't work. Because the source of my anxiety wasn't in the room. It was me. When I turned around, he was standing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said quickly. "You didn't," I lied. He stepped further in. "I was just wondering if you wanted me to pick up anything tomorrow. I'm making a grocery run." I said yes. Or maybe I said no. I don't remember what I said. Because right then, the silence became unbearable. We stood there, across the kitchen, a foot or two closer than necessary. And in that space, it happened. We didn't plan it. We didn't speak. There was no build-up, no clever line, no trembling confession. We kissed. And then we pulled away, breathless. The sound of the kettle behind me, shrieking into the air, snapped us both back into motion. I turned quickly, shut it off, grabbed the cup. He stepped back. We didn't look at each other again. He left the kitchen first. I stood alone, hands shaking as I poured the water. I told myself it meant nothing. That it was a moment of confusion. A misstep. A lapse in judgment. That people sometimes react without thinking, and it doesn't have to mean everything. But the truth was louder than my excuses. It meant something. Because for the first time in years, I had felt seen. Touched. Not just physically, that was barely the point, but emotionally. Intimately. As if someone had read a language I had forgotten how to write. When my husband returned later that night, I greeted him with a hug that felt rehearsed. He asked how my day was. I said it was quiet. He didn't press. He never did. Lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, my body tense under the sheets. I could still feel the press of someone else's lips. I could still hear the silence that followed. I didn't sleep. I watched the shadows shift across the room as the night moved on, wondering how many small mistakes it takes to destroy a life. Wondering if it was already too late. The following days passed like slow-moving clouds, heavy with tension but never breaking. We did not speak of what happened in the kitchen. In fact, we barely spoke at all. But the silence between us now had a pulse. It hummed through every room of the house, invisible yet persistent, wrapping around my shoulders like a second skin. Every time we crossed paths, in the hallway, the laundry room, even just exchanging glances over dinner, I felt my body tense, as if bracing for a storm that refused to arrive. I had built my life on order, discipline, structure. Now that very structure was buckling under something I couldn't label. I told myself it was attraction, a harmless lapse in judgment. But it wasn't that simple. The real weight came not from desire, but from how deeply he had slipped into the parts of me I had kept protected, the quiet parts, the unsaid parts, the ones that longed for acknowledgement without explanation. At work, I started avoiding eye contact. My students sensed something had shifted. I became impatient during lectures, quick to dismiss questions I would usually welcome. In session with clients, I found myself disconnected. Their pain, once something I held with care, now felt distant. I was inside my own storm, and there was no room left for anyone else's weather. One afternoon, I sat in my parked car outside the university for almost 40 minutes after a lecture. I didn't check my phone. I didn't listen to the radio. I simply stared at the dashboard, the steering wheel, the faint reflection of my eyes in the glass. I wondered who I had become. Or worse, who I had always been, beneath the scaffolding of my choices. That night, I returned home later than usual. The house was quiet, dimly lit. My husband wasn't home yet, still tied up in a work dinner he'd mentioned 2 days earlier. I walked in and found the living room empty, except for the faint sound of music coming from the kitchen. Piano, soft and unfamiliar. I walked in slowly. He stood near the sink, a dish towel slung over his shoulder, rinsing a plate. He looked up and smiled, polite, restrained, distant. I mirrored it. There were no words. I poured a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and stared out the window. He didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't offer it. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was active. A field of landmines we both had learned to navigate, at least for now. But one misstep and everything would ignite. That evening, I went up to our bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed for a long time. My husband came home after 10. I heard him moving around downstairs, his footsteps slow, methodical. Eventually, the sounds faded. He didn't come up. Or maybe he did, and I didn't notice. The next morning, I awoke early. The house was still. I tiptoed down to the kitchen and found the table set with 2 cups, already prepared for coffee. My mug, the chipped one, was waiting. I stood staring at it for what felt like a full minute, trying to decide if the gesture meant anything. I poured my drink, sat in silence, and stared at the rising steam. He entered the kitchen just as I was about to leave. We both froze for a moment, then resumed our movements like nothing had happened. Like everything was normal. I'm heading out later, he said casually, wiping his hands on a towel. Let me know if you need anything from town. I nodded, eyes on the floor. I'm good, thank you. That was all. But even that small interaction made my chest ache. Not because of what we said, but because of everything we didn't. I felt like I was trying to survive in a room where the oxygen had slowly been replaced with fog. In the days that followed, I attempted to re-establish control. I created a new schedule, took on extra student meetings, started cooking more elaborate dinners. My husband seemed pleased by this sudden burst of energy. He commented once, during dinner, "You seem more like yourself lately." I almost choked on my water. He didn't realize that what he saw wasn't a return, but a cover-up. I was not myself. I didn't even know what that meant anymore. The worst part wasn't guilt. It was confusion. I didn't feel like someone who had done something terrible. I felt like someone who had been pulled awake from a very long sleep. And I didn't know whether to resent the one who had done the waking or to follow them deeper into whatever this was becoming. One late evening, I found myself in the guest room. Not with him. Alone. The bed was neatly made, barely touched. I sat on the edge and looked around, the books he had stacked in the corner, the jacket slung over the back of a chair, the scent that had slowly become part of the air. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a mirror. And I didn't like what it reflected. I went to my office the next day and closed the door behind me. I opened my journal, one I hadn't written in for months, and began a list. When did I stop wanting to be seen? When did comfort replace intimacy? Why didn't I notice I was disappearing? I wrote until my hand cramped. I didn't read it back. I just closed the cover and left it on the desk. That night, we crossed paths again. I was coming out of the laundry room, he was heading down the stairs. We both stopped. For a second, neither of us moved. I looked at him, really looked, and felt my breath catch. Not from desire. Not from shame. From the recognition that something irreversible had happened, and pretending otherwise was no longer possible. But still, we said nothing. He stepped aside. I walked past. And the house, our home, kept pretending with us. It swallowed our silences, muffled our footsteps, carried our secrets in its walls. But it was getting harder. Every day, it was getting harder. I began to compartmentalize my life with the precision of a surgeon. Every gesture, every conversation, every movement was carefully filed into invisible categories: safe, neutral, dangerous. I went about my days as if on autopilot, presenting a version of myself that was efficient and agreeable. But beneath the surface, I was unraveling. The quiet between us had become unbearable, and still we said nothing. That, somehow, made it worse. My husband remained oblivious to the shifts in my behavior, or perhaps he noticed and chose not to engage. I couldn't decide which would hurt more, that he didn't see me, or that he saw me and looked away. Either way, the distance between us had solidified into something too large to cross with words alone. One Thursday afternoon, I came home to find the house empty. My husband had left a note on the counter: dinner meeting, back late. The handwriting was rushed, as if even the message had been an afterthought. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, reading the note over and over, though it said nothing new. The pattern had become familiar. I wandered into the living room, where the windows had been left open. The curtains stirred gently in the breeze, casting soft, rhythmic shadows on the floor. I sat down on the couch and allowed myself to breathe fully, deeply, for the first time in days. The silence in the house was different without my husband. It wasn't weighted. It didn't demand performance. It simply existed. I closed my eyes and listened, the ticking clock, the wind through the trees, the distant hum of a car passing by. Normal sounds. But even they felt changed. He returned home shortly after sunset. I heard the front door, the shuffle of shoes, the familiar creak of the floorboard near the hallway. I didn't move from the couch. I watched the doorway, waiting to see if he would enter. He didn't. Instead, I heard the faint clinking of dishes. Then running water. Then quiet. Eventually, he passed by the living room without looking in. I could have called out. I didn't. I remained still, watching the shadows crawl up the wall. Something inside me refused to be the one to reach anymore. The next morning, I overslept. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window and the absence of any movement in the house. My husband had already left. There was no note this time. Just silence. I walked into the kitchen and found it tidy, as if no one had been there at all. The absence of the chipped mug was the only clue that someone had passed through. I stood for a while, unsure what to do with the sudden emptiness of the day. My schedule had cleared unexpectedly, a cancelled session, a rescheduled meeting. I had no obligations. And somehow, that felt dangerous. By midday, I found myself outside, walking with no direction. I passed familiar streets, familiar homes, but I felt like a stranger moving through someone else's memory. I ended up at a small park on the edge of town, a place I hadn't visited in years. I sat on a bench and watched the wind move through the trees, bending them with quiet insistence. A child laughed somewhere nearby. The sound felt far away. I tried to remember the last time I had done something for no reason. The last time I had moved without agenda, without duty, without fear. I couldn't. My days had become a long chain of responsibilities. Everything I did had a purpose, a goal, a consequence, a box to check. But not today. Later that evening, I returned home just as the sun was beginning to set. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, and the air was warm. I paused on the porch, reluctant to step back into the structure of my life. Inside, he was in the kitchen. He turned as I entered, holding a glass of water, his expression unreadable. I hesitated, unsure what to say. "You were out," he said quietly, not accusing, just stating. I nodded. "I needed some air." He nodded back. Then, after a pause, he said, "You look more settled." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. Because I wasn't settled. I was just tired. We stood there for a few more seconds, the kind of seconds that stretch endlessly, filled with possibilities that neither of us dared to touch. "I should get back to what I was doing," he said, finally. I stepped aside to let him pass, our shoulders almost brushing. The scent of him, soap, something earthy, lingered in the air between us. I closed my eyes and held my breath until the moment passed. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I lay on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the television playing low just for the noise. I watched a documentary about mountain climbers. People who risk everything to reach the top, knowing the descent could kill them. I understood them. Sometimes, the need to feel alive outweighs the need to be safe. Around 3 in the morning, I turned off the television and stared at the ceiling. I imagined a different life. Not necessarily with him, not even necessarily without my husband. Just a version of myself that didn't feel like she was constantly apologizing for her own existence. I imagined a kitchen where the silence wasn't heavy. A bedroom where presence wasn't confused with proximity. A mirror where my reflection looked back without judgment. But I knew imagination wasn't enough. Morning came too soon. I woke stiff, every muscle sore from the awkward angle of the couch. I got up slowly, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window as the sky shifted from gray to gold. Behind me, I heard footsteps. He walked in, stopped when he saw me, then went to the counter without a word. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Because I knew the moment I did, I would say something I couldn't take back. Instead, I sipped my coffee and said nothing. But inside, I was screaming. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the kiss, and still we hadn't spoken about it. But silence, I was learning, could be louder than words. The house was filled with unsaid things, heavy, unspoken truths that hung in the air like smoke. Every time we found ourselves in the same room, I felt like I was holding my breath, as though the simple act of inhaling might cause everything to ignite. I kept waiting for him to bring it up. To say it had been a mistake. To ask what it meant. But he didn't. And neither did I. Instead, we tiptoed around it, both too afraid to give shape to something that was already altering everything. There was safety in silence, but also suffocation. My husband remained unaware, though I wasn't sure if it was obliviousness or willful ignorance. He had started coming home later than usual, and when he was home, he was distracted, eyes on his phone, attention fractured, his presence more routine than real. I told myself it wasn't personal. That we had both slipped into a kind of quiet numbness over the years. But now that I had seen what it felt like to be noticed, that numbness stung. One Saturday afternoon, my husband suggested we all go to the gallery downtown, a temporary exhibition he had been invited to by a colleague. I agreed without hesitation. Perhaps part of me wanted the illusion of normalcy. Or perhaps I was just tired of hiding in plain sight. We dressed and left together, the three of us in the same car, like some strange portrait of a functioning household. My husband drove, I sat in the front, and he was in the back seat, quietly watching the world blur past the windows. No one said much. The air between us felt too thick for small talk. At the gallery, I tried to focus on the art. I let my eyes move across canvases and sculptures, absorbing their colors, shapes, textures. But none of it registered. My mind kept drifting, back to the kitchen, to the hallway, to the way my skin still remembered the press of his lips. At one point, I turned a corner and found myself in a small room, apart from the rest. The painting on the wall was abstract, dark blues bleeding into grays, streaks of crimson clawing through the center. It looked like grief. Or maybe longing. I stood there alone, not realizing he had followed me in. He stopped beside me, just close enough to feel, not touch. We stared at the painting in silence. I didn't look at him. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "This one feels honest," I said. He didn't reply right away. Then, after a pause, "It's the only one here that made me stop walking." We stayed like that for a few more seconds, still, suspended. Then the sound of footsteps in the hallway reminded us where we were. Who we were. My husband appeared moments later, gesturing toward the main exhibit. "They're serving wine in the back," he said casually. "Let's not miss it." We followed him without a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my husband's breathing, wondering how we had arrived here. I thought about the gallery, about that painting. About the fact that someone had created it with their hands, poured something personal and raw onto canvas, and then hung it in a room for strangers to interpret. I envied that kind of bravery. The audacity of being seen. The next morning, I told my husband I needed some time to myself. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. I drove out of town to a nearby lake, a place we used to visit when we were first married. Back then, we would pack lunches, bring books, spend entire afternoons sprawled out on the grass talking about things we wanted to build. A life. A home. A future. I sat by the water for hours, letting the breeze wrap around me, my thoughts flickering like the surface of the lake. I tried to remember what it felt like to be certain of anything. I couldn't. When I finally returned home, the house was quiet. My husband wasn't back yet. I moved through the rooms slowly, the familiar objects feeling foreign under my fingertips. The chipped mug on the counter. The blanket draped over the arm of the couch. The book he had left open by the window. And then I saw him in the garden, pulling weeds with one hand and shielding his eyes from the sun with the other. He hadn't noticed me yet. I watched him for a long moment. Not with desire. Not even with guilt. Just with the stark realization that something irreversible had shifted between us. Something we had both allowed. I opened the back door and stepped outside. He looked up, surprised. We hadn't really been alone since the gallery. Not like this. Not with the weight of everything between us. I thought you might still be out, he said. I didn't answer. I walked toward him slowly, unsure what I was doing, only that I needed to do something. I stopped a few feet away. Do you regret it? I asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stood, and met my eyes. No. The word landed gently, but it shook something loose in me. I don't know what to do with that, I said, voice barely audible. You don't have to know, he replied. You just have to be honest with yourself. I wanted to be angry at him for saying that. For making it sound so simple. But I couldn't. Because part of me knew he was right. We didn't say anything else. We didn't touch. We just stood there, the late afternoon light turning the garden golden around us. I thought of all the things I wanted to ask, how he saw me, what he expected, whether he thought this would ever become more than a moment we buried beneath the surface. But I didn't ask. I turned and walked back into the house. I spent the rest of the evening in my office, staring at a blank document on my screen. I thought about writing it all down. Not to confess. Not to explain. Just to make sense of it. But the words wouldn't come. Because this wasn't a story yet. It was still happening. Still unfolding. Still pulling me further away from the life I had built. I tried to return to normal. I told myself I could undo what had happened by acting like it hadn't. I filled my days with structure, clients, lectures, cleaning, groceries, errands. Every list I completed gave me the illusion of control, but beneath it all, there was a constant hum, like a faint frequency only I could hear. It followed me from room to room. It kept me awake at night. It made the familiar feel foreign. My husband seemed grateful for my sudden focus on the domestic. He complimented the meals, noted how clean the house was, asked fewer questions. Maybe he thought I had come out of a fog. Maybe he was just relieved not to be asked for anything himself. Whatever the reason, he didn't press. He never did. But the distance between us was no longer a crack. It was a fault line. One evening, I found myself folding laundry in the guest room. The scent of his cologne lingered on the collar of a shirt he had tossed in the basket days earlier. I stared at the fabric in my hands, holding it longer than necessary, then set it down and walked away. It felt like betrayal just to notice. I began avoiding him, not overtly, not rudely, but with subtle maneuvers I had perfected over time. I would step into another room just before he entered. I'd take my coffee upstairs when I heard him in the kitchen. I adjusted my schedule to leave when he arrived. It was cowardly, perhaps, but it was all I could manage. Still, avoidance is its own form of communication. And he was too perceptive not to notice. One afternoon, as I was gathering my things to leave for the university, I passed him in the hallway. He didn't move aside. We stopped face to face, the space between us suddenly small. You can't keep doing this, he said, not accusing, just observing. I didn't reply. I shifted my bag on my shoulder and glanced past him. I'm not asking for anything, he added, softer now. I just don't want to be invisible. His words landed like a weight on my chest. I didn't say what I was thinking, neither do I. I walked past him, the brush of my coat against his arm sending a chill down my spine. I didn't look back. Later that night, I sat alone on the back porch. The air was cool, the sky clear. I could hear the low buzz of insects in the grass, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The quiet had stopped feeling peaceful. Now it just reminded me of everything we weren't saying. I thought about calling someone, my sister, maybe, or an old friend. But I didn't want to hear my own voice explain this. I didn't want to lie. And I couldn't tell the truth. Instead, I poured a glass of wine and let my thoughts circle. I tried to remember the last time my husband and I had truly talked. Not exchanged schedules or discussed bills, but talked about fears, memories, the strange ache that sometimes settles in the chest without warning. I couldn't remember. We had built a life together that looked whole from the outside. But inside, it was hollowing. We weren't fighting. We weren't cruel. We just weren't. The next morning, he left for a 3-day conference. He kissed my cheek as he always did. I nodded, smiled, and waved as he backed out of the driveway. I watched the car disappear around the corner and felt nothing. That, more than anything, terrified me. Inside, the house felt different. Larger. Emptier. Freer. By late afternoon, I found myself baking. It was something I hadn't done in years, used to love, then forgot. The smell of cinnamon and vanilla filled the kitchen. I worked in silence, moving with rhythm, trying not to think. But thought came anyway. What scared me most wasn't that I had stepped outside my marriage. It was how easy it had been. Not the act, but the shift. The way one moment cracked open another. The way silence can draw two people together just as easily as it can push others apart. I heard the back door open, the familiar creak of the hinge. I didn't turn around. I waited. His footsteps were soft but unhurried. "You're baking," he said behind me. I used to do it all the time. I remember. I finished wiping the counter, then leaned against it, finally turning to face him. He looked tired. Not physically. Tired in the way people are when they've been carrying something too long. "You don't owe me anything," he said. The words caught me off guard. Not because they were unexpected, but because they were exactly what I'd been trying to tell myself and failing to believe. "I know," I said quietly. He stepped closer, just enough to blur the line between space and suggestion. His voice was low. "But if I'm being honest, I want something anyway." "What is it?" I asked, though I already knew. "Just a moment." There was no pause, no build-up. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't reckless. We kissed. And then it was over. The silence returned, but this time it pulsed with clarity. He stepped back. I turned away. Neither of us said a word. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed. But everything had. The world tilted slightly on its axis. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make balance impossible. I thought about telling my husband. Not everything. Not directly. Just enough truth to reset the scale. But what truth, exactly? That I had started slipping before anything happened? That I had wanted to feel something, anything, so badly I invited chaos in? That I had chosen not to choose? I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I got up, walked quietly to the guest room, and sat on the edge of his bed. The sheets were freshly washed. A book lay face down on the nightstand. The window was cracked just enough to let the wind in. I stayed there for a long time. Not sleeping. Not thinking. Just breathing in a space I no longer knew how to leave. The morning after the second kiss, I awoke before dawn. The house was silent, wrapped in that peculiar stillness that only exists before anyone stirs. I lay there for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, unsure if I had actually slept. My body felt heavy, but my mind was sharp, teetering on the edge of some conclusion I wasn't ready to name. The weight of what had happened settled deeper into me, and I knew that what had once been avoidable was now irreversible. My husband was still away, expected home later that evening. That knowledge alone changed the rhythm of the day. It gave me a kind of permission, not to act recklessly, but to finally allow myself to confront what I had been avoiding. I had spent weeks pretending to be undecided, but the truth had been living in my bones all along. I didn't see him until after breakfast. He was in the backyard, watering the herb planters I'd stopped tending months ago. I watched him through the window, letting the motion of his hands, slow, methodical, lull me into something between calm and dread. It wasn't guilt that held me still. It was the sense that we had passed through a doorway that couldn't be closed again, no matter how careful we were. Eventually, I joined him. I didn't plan it. I just opened the door and stepped outside, drawn by the weight of everything unspoken between us. He didn't look at me right away. His voice, when it came, was even. "He's back tonight." I nodded. "I know." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was measured. Deliberate. We both understood that what we said now would decide more than we were ready to face. And yet, neither of us stepped away. "I didn't plan any of this," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I know," he answered. "But it happened anyway." I wanted to ask if he blamed me, but I already knew he didn't. He was too self-contained for that. Too aware of his own role in what we had become. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I busied myself with errands, folding laundry, organizing drawers that hadn't been touched in years. Anything to keep my hands moving, my mind distracted. Every time I slowed down, my thoughts returned to the same place, not the act itself, but the meaning behind it. What it said about who I had become. What I had been willing to risk just to feel something again. That evening, I prepared dinner. Nothing elaborate, just something warm and simple. I didn't do it out of obligation, but out of habit. Rituals were anchors. I needed the illusion of control, even as everything around me felt increasingly unstable. My husband arrived just after 7. He looked tired, but not unusually so. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and complimented the smell of the kitchen. We sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed in its usual rhythm: updates about work, a funny moment from the conference, a comment about traffic. He didn't notice how often I looked at my hands, or how tightly I gripped the edge of my napkin. After dinner, he went upstairs to unpack, and I stayed behind, cleaning the kitchen slowly, methodically. Each plate and glass felt like a decision, a postponement, a quiet plea for time. Later, he returned to the living room with his laptop, settling into his usual spot on the couch. I sat opposite him, pretending to read, though I couldn't absorb a single word. We existed beside each other, not touching, not speaking, but sharing space like actors in a scene neither of us had written. Eventually, he looked up and said, "You've been quiet lately." I raised my eyes, unsure of how to respond. I could lie, easily. I could say I was tired. Stressed. Distracted by work. But none of those things were the truth. "I've had a lot on my mind," I said carefully. He nodded, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. When we went to bed, he fell asleep quickly. I didn't. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling once more, counting the seconds between his breaths. I thought about how much we had lost without ever realizing it. Not to tragedy or betrayal, but to distance. To silence. To the slow erosion of intimacy. And then I got up. I moved quietly down the hall, barefoot, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't knock. I opened the door and stepped inside. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, as if waiting. We didn't speak. We spent the night together. There was no pretense. No drama. Just two people sharing something fragile, something already broken before it began. And when morning came, we didn't say goodbye. We simply parted, like clouds dispersing after a storm. Later that day, I sat at my desk staring at my calendar, the days ahead marked by appointments and deadlines that suddenly felt meaningless. I had crossed a line I could never return from. And I didn't know yet what that would cost me. But I knew the bill would come due. I wasn't ready for it. But I wasn't running anymore either. The morning after was a quiet one, but not in the way that felt comforting. It was the kind of silence that hummed with unfinished thoughts and unsaid truths. The kind that presses against your chest and makes every ordinary movement feel slightly off balance. I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, my hands resting flat against the countertop. The steam rose slowly, catching the morning light in little curls. It was an ordinary scene, and yet everything had changed. He wasn't there. Not in the kitchen, not in the hallway, not in the living room. His absence wasn't deliberate, it was respectful. He had given me space. It should have made me feel grateful. Instead, I felt hollow. As if, in giving me room to breathe, he'd also left me with the full weight of what had happened. I didn't eat breakfast. I drank my tea too quickly, burning my tongue, and spent the next hour reorganizing a cabinet that didn't need it. I needed motion, some proof that I was still part of the world but operated in cause and effect, in effort and result. Something linear, something safe. But the truth was, nothing in my life felt linear anymore. By mid-morning, my husband returned from the pharmacy. He greeted me with a distracted kiss on the cheek, mentioned something about refilling prescriptions, and went upstairs. I nodded in all the right places, pretending I was still in the same script we had rehearsed for years. But I wasn't. I spent the afternoon reading emails, half answering some, deleting others before I could finish the first sentence. At some point I went outside and sat on the back steps, arms wrapped around my knees, staring at the garden. The herbs he had watered were thriving again, sprouting green from the wooden boxes we had once built together, back when weekends meant shared projects and not quiet parallel lives. It occurred to me that I had no idea where he was. I hadn't seen him all day. The absence felt intentional. Not avoidance, exactly, more like a quiet understanding that some space is needed to stay untouched for a while. I should have felt relief. I didn't. I missed his presence in a way I couldn't articulate, not even to myself. Because what I missed wasn't comfort. It was aliveness. That evening, my husband suggested we go for a walk. It was one of those rare early autumn nights when the air was crisp but not cold, the kind that used to invite conversation. We walked in near silence, our footsteps crunching over dry leaves. He pointed out the neighbor's new mailbox. I commented on the chill in the air. That was the extent of it. No mention of work, no questions about each other. Just noise to fill the silence. When we returned, he sat down in the living room with a book, and I disappeared into my office. I stared at the computer screen, the blinking cursor on an empty document. I told myself I would write. That I needed to get it all down. But I couldn't. Every sentence that came to mind felt like a betrayal, even though the betrayal had already happened. Instead, I opened an old folder, one that held personal notes I hadn't looked at in years. Observations, fragments of thought, scraps of memory. I scrolled through them slowly, searching for the woman I used to be. She was there, in the lines between the words, hopeful, curious, fragile. I barely recognized her. A knock at the door broke the stillness. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I could. I'm heading to bed, my husband said from the hallway. I turned slightly in my chair, catching his shadow just beyond the frame of the door. Okay, I said, my voice soft, rehearsed. You coming? In a bit. He nodded, then disappeared. I sat there for a while after that, the glow of the screen illuminating the room, the rest of the house sinking into quiet. Eventually, I stood and turned everything off. My footsteps echoed slightly on the wood floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. But I didn't go to our bedroom. I walked down the hallway and paused outside the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, just as I had left it. I pushed it open slowly, expecting him to be gone. But he was there, sitting by the window, his back to me, the glow of his phone lighting up his face for a moment before he set it aside. He didn't speak. Neither did I. I stood there in the doorway, unsure what I had come to say. Maybe I just needed confirmation that I hadn't imagined everything. Then it wasn't some elaborate misreading of a situation I'd been too tired to interpret correctly. I didn't leave because I regret it, he said, not turning around. I swallowed hard. Then why? Because I didn't want to take more than you were ready to give. I took a step inside the room, then another. I didn't sit. I didn't move any closer. I just stood there, letting the words settle between us. I don't know what I'm ready for, I admitted. That's okay. Silence stretched again, but it was different now, softer, less like a wait and more like a pause in a conversation that hadn't ended yet. I keep trying to go back to before, I said. To act like nothing's changed. But it has. Even when I'm with him, even when I'm alone, I can't find that version of myself again. He turned toward me then, his expression calm but unflinching. Maybe you're not supposed to. I nodded. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Eventually, I left the room and returned to my own. My husband was asleep, one arm draped across the pillow where I should have been. I lay down beside him carefully, making as little noise as possible. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, counting my breaths, listening to his, wondering if he could sense the shift between us, or if he decided not to look too closely. The house was still. But I wasn't. My thoughts moved like shadows, quiet, restless, always just out of reach. And I realized, with a kind of calm dread, that something inside me had begun to detach. Not from him entirely. Not yet. But from the version of myself that used to think silence was safer than truth. The days that followed were marked by an almost unbearable tension, a silent negotiation of boundaries and desires that neither of us fully understood or dared to articulate. The house, once a refuge, had become a labyrinth of unspoken words and stolen glances, a place where every interaction was weighted with meaning we refused to confront. I found myself retreating into routine as a shield against the chaos within. Morning coffee on the porch, meticulously planned appointments, evenings spent with books I no longer read. Each act was a thread trying to hold together a fabric fraying at the edges. My husband remained distant yet present, his absence during the day a constant reminder of the gulf widening between us. When he was home, his gaze seldom met mine, and conversations were clipped, functional. I sensed his awareness of the shifting dynamics but also his reluctance to address them, as if denial could stave off the inevitable unraveling. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs tucked away in a drawer, I paused at a picture of us taken decades earlier. We were younger, our smiles genuine and unguarded, eyes bright with promise. The contrast between that image and our current reality struck me like a blow. I realized how much time had passed, not just in years but in emotional distance. That evening, the friend who had become an unwelcome fixture in our home sat across from me in the living room. The silence stretched between us, dense and suffocating. He spoke first, his voice low and steady. "I don't want to be the cause of your pain," he said. I looked at him, searching for sincerity, finding only quiet resignation. Neither do I replied. Our conversation unfolded slowly, revealing layers of regret and longing intertwined with fear. There was no accusation, no blame, only a shared acknowledgement of the damage done and the uncertainty ahead. As night deepened, I retreated to the guest room, the space now suffused with memories both comforting and haunting. Lying there, I grappled with the realization that my life was no longer a simple story of right and wrong, but a complex tapestry of choices and consequences. The morning brought with it a fragile calm. My husband and I exchanged few words but shared an unspoken understanding that something had shifted irrevocably. I knew the path forward would be fraught with difficult decisions, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of clarity amidst the turmoil. And though the future remained uncertain, I resolved to face it with honesty, however painful that might be. The morning arrived with a sharp clarity, the kind that often follows sleepless nights. I had spent most of the hours in silence, moving between rooms without purpose, pausing in doorways as if waiting for something to materialize, answers, perhaps, or the courage to say out loud what had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. But nothing came. Just the same heaviness, the same ache that had taken residence in my chest. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds outside seemed reluctant to break the stillness. I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the chipped mug again, the one I had unconsciously used almost every day. It had become symbolic in a way I couldn't fully articulate, of habit, of repetition, of choosing familiarity even when it no longer served me. I washed it slowly, deliberately, as if that small act could scrub away everything I didn't want to carry anymore. My husband came down shortly after, dressed for work, briefcase already in hand. He offered a faint smile, the kind that asked nothing and revealed less. For a moment, I wondered if he would say something, anything, that might shift the trajectory of the day. But he didn't. "Don't wait up," he said as he picked up his keys. I nodded. "Drive safe." He left without a backward glance. The sound of the door closing was softer than I expected, but it echoed through me nonetheless. Alone now, I wandered upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. The linens were smoothed, the pillows neatly arranged, traces of order in a life unraveling. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, even 6 months ago, and how far I had drifted from her. Not because of one moment or one choice, but because of a series of silences, of not listening to the small inner voice that had been warning me, "You are disappearing." And I had disappeared. Not all at once, but piece by piece, in every quiet surrender, every unspoken need. The rest of the day passed like a slow-moving fog. I tried to read. I tried to write. I even tried to call an old friend, but I hung up before the first ring. There were too many questions I wasn't ready to answer, too many layers to peel back without bleeding. It wasn't until dusk that I made my way to the guest room. The door was ajar, the light inside dim. He sat by the window, as he often did, watching the last sliver of sunlight fold itself into the horizon. He turned as I entered, his expression unreadable. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady but soft. He blinked once and nodded. "I thought you might." I stepped further into the room, resting my hand on the back of the chair that had become his makeshift reading spot. "It's not because of you. I know. I need to start telling the truth. To myself. To him. I can't keep living inside 2 lives." He stood then, not closing the space between us, just standing. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I know," I said. "But I wanted to give you one anyway." We stood there for a long moment. He looked at me, not with anger or regret, but with something gentler. Maybe recognition. Maybe gratitude. Maybe both. Will you be okay? I asked, unsure why the question mattered. He nodded. Will you? I don't know, I answered truthfully. I left the room without touching him. Without saying goodbye. It felt like the only honest way to end something that had never been meant to begin. Upstairs, I packed a small suitcase. Not much, just enough to leave for a few days. I wasn't sure where I would go. A hotel. A friend's spare room. Maybe just somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could think. When my husband returned later that night, I was waiting for him in the kitchen. The lights were low, the air still. He paused in the doorway, surprised. You're up. I need to talk, I said simply. He set his things down, his shoulders tensing slightly. Okay. I've made some mistakes, I began, choosing my words slowly. Not just recently, but over years. Letting things go unsaid. Letting myself disappear. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. I don't want to lie to you. Not anymore. His eyes searched mine, not for a confession, but for the part of me he hadn't seen in a long time. I offered it to him, quietly, with no conditions. I'm going away for a little while, I said. I need space to understand what I want. Who I am, apart from this house, this marriage, even apart from him. He looked away, down at the floor, then back at me. Is there someone else? There was, I said. But this isn't about him. It never really was. He nodded slowly. And what happens after? I don't know yet. That was the truth. I picked up my suitcase and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the streetlights glowing softly against the pavement. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether we would find our way back to each other, or whether this was the beginning of something completely different. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't hiding. And that, I realized, was a beginning in itself. I walked to the car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look back.